About 6 months ago, I found out someone had been living inside of my house. I know that sentence sounds fake already, like one of those made up internet horror stories people repost every October, but this actually happened to me, and I still get nervous in completely silent houses because of it. I was renting the bottom half of an old duplex on the edge of town. The place was cheap because it was old and kind of awkwardly renovated. At some point decades ago, it had been one large family home before somebody split it into 2 units. I had the ground floor and basement, while the upstairs apartment sat empty most of the time I lived there. The landlord was one of those hands-off guys who only showed up if something was actively leaking or on fire, which honestly suited me fine because I mostly kept to myself anyways. The first weird thing was the food disappearing. Not huge amounts either, little things that were easy to second guess. Bread vanishing faster than I remembered, yogurts missing, half-drunk bottles of juice I didn't remember opening. Once I found a microwave meal box in the trash that I knew I hadn't eaten because I specifically remember saving it for later in the week. I live alone, don't drink, don't do drugs, and at first I genuinely thought stress was affecting my memory because the alternative felt insane. Then, I started hearing noises at night. Not loud noises, but tiny ones, the sound of weight shifting somewhere distant in the house. Small creaks in the kitchen after midnight. Once or twice, I heard what sounded like movement directly above me, even though the upstairs apartment was completely vacant. I even checked the listing online to make sure nobody had rented it without telling me, because the sounds were so distinct, but nothing. One night, around 2 a.m., I heard a metallic clink from the kitchen that sounded exactly like somebody setting down a spoon. I got up immediately and grabbed the baseball bat I had tucked next to my bed. I checked every room slowly, feeling ridiculous the entire time, but nothing was there. Windows locked, back door locked, nothing disturbed. But when I reached the pantry, I noticed the door was slightly open. That bothered me, because the pantry door had a warped hinge that caused it to drift open unless you shut it firmly, and I specifically remembered slamming it earlier that night. Inside the pantry, everything looked normal except for a jar of peanut butter sitting on the floor near the back wall. I hadn't taken it out. I stood there staring at it way longer than I should have. I remember getting this strange feeling in my stomach that I was not alone in the house, even though it was completely silent. After that, things escalated slowly. My dog started acting weird in the kitchen. He'd stand in the doorway, staring at the pantry and growling low in his throat without moving. Sometimes, his ears would perk up, like he was listening to something inside the wall. One night, he refused to walk into the kitchen at all and literally backed away, whining when I tried calling him over. Around the same time, I started noticing small things moved around the house. Cabinet doors slightly open in the mornings. A kitchen chair shifted just enough that I knew it hadn't been where I left it. Once I came home from work and found the TV remote sitting on the bathroom counter. That one really messed with me because I had no explanation whatsoever. I started checking the house obsessively before bed. Closets, basement, shower curtains, every door lock twice. I even convinced myself maybe someone had copied my key somehow, but there were never signs of forced entry and nothing valuable was taken, just food. Tiny disturbances, little reminders that somebody else had been there. The worst night happened about 3 weeks before everything came apart. I woke up around 3 a.m. because I heard movement directly outside of my bedroom. Not footsteps exactly, more like careful, shifting weight. I sat frozen in bed, listening. Then I heard a soft creak from the hallway floorboards. Very slow and deliberate, I grabbed my phone, but I didn't call anyone because some stupid part of my brain still wanted to believe there was a normal explanation. I opened the bedroom door suddenly, expecting to catch somebody there. The hallway was empty, but at the far end near the kitchen, the pantry door was open again. Not cracked open, wide open. I slept in my car that night. The next morning, I finally called the landlord and told him I thought there were rats or raccoons inside the walls because I couldn't bring myself to explain what I actually suspected. He came over annoyed and started checking around. When he reached the pantry, he paused for a second and asked if I'd ever noticed the back panel before. I had no idea what he meant. Behind the pantry shelves, there was a plywood backing painted the same color as the wall. Once he pointed it out, I realized it looked slightly uneven. He knocked against it and the sound echoed hollow behind it. I still remember the exact feeling in my chest at that moment. Cold. Immediate cold. He unscrewed the panel while I stood there holding my breath. Behind it was a narrow hidden space running between the walls of the duplex. It wasn't exactly a crawl space, more like an unfinished maintenance corridor left over from the original structure of the house. It stretched into darkness beyond where we could see, and somebody had clearly been living there. There were blankets piled in the corner, empty cans, bottles of water, flashlights, cigarette butts, food wrappers from my kitchen trash. The smell that came out was horrible, like sweat and mildew trapped together for months. The landlord backed away and told me to call the police. The officers who arrived searched the hidden corridor for almost 40 minutes. Apparently the space connected to multiple parts of the house through old access panels hidden behind vents and fixtures. One officer found an opening behind my bathroom mirror. Another led into the basement ceiling. That was the moment I realized whoever had been back there could have entered my apartment almost any time they wanted. The police believed it was likely a homeless man who had discovered the unused maintenance space while the upstairs apartment sat vacant. Based on the amount of supplies they found, they estimated he'd probably been there for at least 2 months. Then, one of the officers asked me something I'll never forget. He said, "Have you noticed anyone smoking near your bedroom?" I said no. He looked uncomfortable and explained they found cigarette ashes directly outside the vent connected to my room, meaning somebody had been sitting there listening to me sleep. I ended up staying with my sister afterward because I physically could not be inside that house anymore. Even during the daytime, the place felt contaminated somehow. Every creak made me jump. Every shadow looked wrong. The landlord sealed the hidden spaces and installed cameras, but it didn't matter to me anymore. The final thing that destroyed any chance of me staying happened while I was packing to move out. I was taking books off a shelf near my bed when a folded piece of paper slipped from behind them onto the floor. It was dirty and wrinkled, like it had been handled repeatedly. All it said was, "Sorry for scaring your dog." I moved out the same day. When I bought my house, everyone kept telling me how lucky I was. The market was terrible, interest rates were climbing, and somehow I'd managed to get an older 2-story place for way below market value. The realtor explained the previous owner had died unexpectedly, and the house had been sitting empty for almost a year. At the time, I thought that sounded sad but convenient. Looking back, that should have been the first red flag. The house itself was old but solid. Narrow hallways, creaky hardwood floors, outdated wallpaper. The kind of place that always feels a little dim, even during the daytime. Under the staircase near the front hall, there was this small locked door built into the wall. I assumed it was a storage closet. The realtor mentioned that the previous owner used it for tools or winter supplies, but the key had apparently been lost years earlier. At first, I didn't think much about it because I was busy moving and renovating, but within the first couple weeks, I started noticing weird things around the house. Mostly small things, easy to rationalize away. A downstairs light left on when I was sure I'd switched it off. Cabinet doors cracked open in the kitchen. Once I found muddy footprints near the staircase that looked fresh, even though I hadn't worn shoes inside all day. The house also had this strange smell sometimes. It would appear suddenly in the hallway near the stairs. Sweat, damp clothes, something rotten underneath it. Then, hours later, it would vanish completely. I checked the basement thinking maybe there was mold or dead rodents somewhere, but I never found anything. The noises started not long after, mostly late at night. Soft scraping sounds beneath the staircase, tiny thumps. Once, while lying awake around midnight, I heard what sounded unmistakably like coughing coming from inside the wall near the locked door. I sat frozen in bed listening to it. Then silence. The next morning, I actually laughed at myself because my brain immediately jumped to ridiculous conclusions. I convinced myself it had been pipes or the heating system, but after that, I started noticing the locked door constantly. Every time I walked past it, I'd feel uneasy for reasons I couldn't explain. One night, I woke up thirsty around 1 in the morning and walked downstairs for water. Halfway through the hallway, I stopped because I heard movement. Very slow shifting from behind the locked door under the stairs. I stood there barely breathing. Then I heard a soft scrape against wood from the inside. I backed away so fast I nearly dropped my phone. The following day, I called the locksmith because at that point, I just wanted the stupid thing open so I could prove to myself there was nothing inside. The locksmith showed up in the afternoon and started examining the old lock. After about 30 seconds, he stopped working and crouched lower near the floor. Then he looked at me and asked, "You said nobody else had access to this house, right?" I said no. He pointed toward the bottom edge of the door. There were scratch marks on the inside, fresh ones, like somebody dragging metal or fingernails against the wood repeatedly. I immediately felt sick. The locksmith quietly suggested I call the police before opening it, which absolutely terrified me because until then, part of me still thought I was imagining everything. 2 officers arrived maybe 20 minutes later. They searched the house first, checked the exterior doors and windows, then finally stood in front of the locked compartment. One officer positioned himself beside the door, while the other opened the lock. The second the latch clicked, something slammed violently against the inside. All 3 of us jumped backward. The officer pulled the door open while drawing his weapon and shining his flashlight inside. There was a man crouched inside the compartment. I can still picture him perfectly. Filthy beard, hollow eyes, extremely thin. His skin looked gray under the flashlight. He stared at us like an animal cornered in a trap. Then he started screaming. Not words at first, just screaming. Apparently the compartment extended much farther beneath the staircase than anyone realized. It connected to a narrow, unfinished area between the walls where somebody could just barely crawl around. Inside were blankets, canned food, plastic bottles filled with urine, stolen medication, and piles of garbage. The police later figured out the man had been living there since before the previous owner died. According to neighbors, the old homeowner used to let him stay temporarily during winter after he lost his job years earlier. Then the homeowner died suddenly from a heart attack, and the man never left. For nearly a year, he secretly remained inside the house while it sat vacant. Then after I moved in, he just adapted. That part horrified me most. He hadn't broken in after I bought the house. He was already there waiting before I ever moved in. The officers later told me he admitted to coming out almost every night after I went to sleep. He'd use the bathroom, eat food from my kitchen, and watch television sometimes. He apparently believed the house still belonged to him in some way. Like mentally he'd convinced himself he had more right to be there than anyone else. After they arrested him, I spent hours walking through the house trying to process everything. Suddenly, every strange moment from the past month made sense. The smells, the noises, the moved objects. Then I found something that completely shattered me. Inside my bedroom closet, hidden behind hanging coats, was a small folding chair facing directly toward my bed. It wasn't mine, and underneath it was an empty coffee cup that was still warm. About 3 years ago, I rented the upper floor of this old converted house while finishing grad school. It wasn't a great place, but rent was cheap and it was close to campus. The downstairs tenant was an older woman who mostly kept to herself, and the landlord lived out of state, so we rarely saw him. Overall, it seemed quiet and uneventful. For the first month, everything was normal. Then, one night, I heard footsteps above me. Not on the roof, but inside the ceiling. At first, it sounded faint, almost like careful crawling across wooden beams. I muted my TV and listened harder. The movement stopped instantly. I remember sitting there, staring upward, trying to convince myself it was probably raccoons in the attic or old pipes shifting with temperature changes. The attic access hatch was located in the hallway ceiling outside my apartment, so the next day I mentioned the noises to the landlord over the phone. He sent somebody out to check. The maintenance guy opened the hatch, looked around with a flashlight for maybe 2 minutes, and said he didn't see anything unusual. But the noises kept happening, always late at night, and slowly they became harder to explain away. Sometimes I'd hear distinct creaking directly over specific rooms, like somebody carefully adjusting their weight above the ceiling. Once, around 1 a.m., I heard what sounded unmistakably like whispering overhead. Another night, I heard 3 slow knocks directly above my bedroom. I started sleeping with headphones on because the constant noises were wrecking my nerves. Then things inside my apartment started moving. Nothing dramatic at first, just subtle things easy to question afterward. Cabinet doors left open in the morning. My backpack relocated to different chairs. Once I found my laptop shut after specifically leaving it open to finish an assignment. I genuinely started wondering if stress and sleep deprivation were affecting me because grad school was already destroying my mental state. One afternoon, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was dirt on top of my washing machine, fresh dirt, and directly above it in the ceiling was a square outline I'd somehow never noticed before. A maintenance hatch painted the same color as the ceiling. I stared at it for a long time without opening it. For some reason, I didn't want confirmation of what I already suspected. A few days later, I got sick and stayed home from classes. Around noon, I heard movement overhead again, except this time it sounded fast and frantic, heavy shifting and crawling, and sudden footsteps sprinting across the attic above me. I stepped into the hallway just in time to hear the attic hatch slam shut overhead. I remember standing there completely frozen because one horrifying realization hit me immediately. Whatever had been up there thought I wasn't home. I called the police right away. 2 officers arrived and searched the attic while I waited outside, trying not to panic. They didn't find anybody up there, but they did find evidence someone had been living in the crawl space for quite a while. Blankets, canned food, bottles of water, drug paraphernalia, old newspapers, and stolen mail from surrounding neighborhoods. Then they found the opening. Hidden behind insulation was a narrow gap connecting the attic to the spaces between the walls and ceilings of the apartments below. The officer explained somebody could move through sections of the building without being easily heard. That explained the noises. It also explained how objects inside my apartment had been moved. Apparently there was an access panel in my laundry room ceiling, allowing entry directly into my unit. I had literally walked beneath it every day without noticing. For the next couple weeks, things quieted down. I stayed with friends occasionally because being alone there started making me anxious. But police believed whoever had been staying in the attic likely fled after hearing me call them. Then the downstairs tenant disappeared. Police initially thought maybe she'd gone to visit family because she was older and lived quietly, but after several days they forced entry into her apartment. There were signs of a struggle inside. Blood near the kitchen sink, furniture overturned, her car still parked outside. The investigation escalated immediately. About a week later, they found her body buried in a wooded area outside of town. The man responsible was arrested in another state after trying to break into an abandoned property. Investigators eventually connected him to multiple cases involving vacant homes and illegal occupation of crawl spaces and attics. Apparently, he'd secretly lived inside different buildings for years without tenants realizing it. According to detectives, he'd been staying inside her house for almost 3 months. The detail that terrifies me most came later during an interview with investigators. They told me the man kept notebooks documenting the people living in houses he occupied. Inside were schedules, routines, observations, and descriptions. There were pages about both tenants in our building, descriptions of when we left for work, what groceries we bought, which lights we kept on at night. The entry about me was the worst. It read, "Upstairs tenant notices sounds too much, watches ceilings, almost caught me twice." Then underneath that, in different handwriting pressure like he'd been angry while writing it, "Need to deal with problems soon."